Hello, welcome to the discussion series called Us Against Hunger. My name is Femi Oke. I am your moderator for the next 1 hour. This discussion series looks at some of the main reasons people are still hungry around the world. Today, climate crisis and how it impacts hunger and food security or food insecurity. Standing by, we have three brilliant panelists who really understand that connection between climate crisis and hunger. You can ask them questions, you can talk to them, they can inspire your conversation. You see that little section there on your screen where you can put your questions and your comments? Use it. I am not saving your comments and questions to the end. That's not how a conversation goes. I'm going to be putting them all the way through this 1 hour. So do get started. I can't wait to hear from you. We are going to begin our discussion today with the World Food Programme for America President and CEO, Baron Seeger. Baron, over to you.
Thanks, Femi. And by the way, welcome to everybody who's attending today, Us Against Hunger. We call it Us Against Hunger because no organization, no one individual does it alone. It's all of us working together. And today we're going to focus on climate change. The World Food Program right now is facing three significant challenges. There's climate, there's COVID, and there's conflict. And today we're going to talk about climate. And we're all familiar with climate, but we're asking for you to stay with us today to learn more about what's happening on the ground, who climate is affecting, and what some of the solutions are. When you think about the World Food Program, we are currently helping 114 million people survive around the world. And unfortunately, we have 4 countries on the verge of famine. And climate is one of the main reasons that we're hurting today, that the world is hurting today. Think about parts of Central America, once known for its lush greenery, for vegetation. Today, it's commonly referred to as the dry corridor. 1.7 million people are in need of food. Climate is creating challenges for the World Food Program that we never envisioned. And it's only getting worse, but there are solutions. So what we're asking today is you stay with us, be part of the conversation, ask questions, listen to the panelists, be part of the solution for climate change. It's hurting the earth. Much of the earth, by the way, almost a quarter of land that farmers could use years ago are not accessible anymore because of climate. We're asking for you to come on this journey with us. Be part of the solution, be part of the dialogue. We need your help. The World Food Program is on the ground in 88 different countries, working to solve hunger and overcome the challenges of climate. Go on this journey with us. Femi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Baron. Baron is the President and CEO of World Food Programme USA. So we have these challenges, the challenges of climate change. How do you address them using climate action? Take a look. Time to meet your panel. Hello, Gernot. Hello, Laura. Hello, Hindou. So good to have you in the conversation today. Gernot, tell everybody who you are, what you do, why you're important.
Hello, Femi. Hello, everybody. My name is Gernot Laganda. I'm the Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at the World Food Programme. This team is working on programs which help communities and governments understand and also anticipate climate risks on food systems and to implement concrete projects that help manage these emerging and dynamic risks. I'm really excited to be here, also on the verge of Earth Day tomorrow, to have this conversation, and I greatly look forward to it.
We look forward to having that conversation with you. Hello, Laura. Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Laura Melo. I'm the country director for WFP in Guatemala in Central America, one of the countries that has been seriously impacted by climate and where food security is every day affected by issues related to climate. So I'll be very happy to share some of the experiences and what we're going through here. Some of the most vulnerable people really struggling to make ends meet, as they say, because of climate.
Thanks, Laura.
Happy to share my experience.
We're looking forward to you sharing. And hello, Hindou. Introduce yourself to our US hunger conversation.
Thank you, Femi. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be in this panel, especially with the two great panelists. So my name is Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim. I am from Chad. I am an indigenous person from Mbororo pastoralist communities. So I don't need to tell you why I'm in this conversation, because already my peoples live independent from the nature, and I am working on climate change adaptation, mitigations, and trying to implement the project on the ground and linking mostly to the international advocacy. And of course, tomorrow it's the Earth Day, and tomorrow is an important day for all indigenous people. So that's what I'm doing.
So we have climate change panel and we have hunger panel. Those two connect. Hindou, if you take us to Chad and you were going to take us around, what example would you show us? Who would you introduce us to help us understand that connection between the climate crisis and hunger?
Absolutely right. So when you come with me over to Chad, who is the country in the middle of the Sahel, landlocked country, but we have an incredible ecosystem between desert, savannas, and the tropical forest. So my people, who are the nomadic pastoralists, indigenous communities, is still some of them 100% nomadic, living from one place to another one, following the rain, following the pastures and the water. So that directly connected with the food, life, and livelihood that we have. And with the climate change impact, we are seeing in the Sahel regions, and particularly in the Chad, we are already in plus 1.5 degree. But how we get there? Because we are seeing how our season change. The rain season become heavier with the flood. This is exactly what is happening last year. And the drought, where we can face also all the crops dry up. And then that create a consequences, the conflict between the communities fighting over the resources. Because if you are a farmer, and in our communities, in our regions, it is a patriarchal issue. So you are a farmer or pastoralist. You cannot get your crops or get a cattle who can graze to get the milk. So you cannot able to feed your families. And when you are not able to feed your families, your dignity is under threat, because the food is the first things that you need for your family to secure. And when your family is there, cannot eat, you cannot just stay there. So the alternative is either you have to leave your community to become a migrant, internal or international migrant, or other you have to face the terror groups and then join or not join them in order to save your family and to save the food. So the climate change have a different faces, but climate change and food, it is the most faces that we are seeing around all the Sahel regions. Food insecurity last year, when you see the report actually of the World Food Programme, seeing that Chad is the most vulnerable in red, dark red. But we do not used to be in the dark red. Why it's becoming now? Because of the extreme weather event due to the climate change impact.
Gernot, you have this global view because what you are trying to do is looking at the risk management and resilience of what is possible to do, even though we're in the middle of a climate crisis. Different parts of the world are impacted, and different people in different parts of the world are impacted differently. If you were able to just stand back a little bit for us and give us a global view of where the climate crisis is hitting the hardest, what would you share?
Well, climate drives hunger in two ways, really. I mean, first, this is probably what is already well known through the media. There are these extreme events such as droughts, storms, floods. These cause widespread losses and damages to food systems all over the world. This includes the US, Europe, Africa, Asia. These extreme events wipe out harvests, they destroy storage facilities, interrupt water, energy supply, prevent access to markets. And these climate extremes often require humanitarian assistance to save lives. I think this is a part of the story that's already very, very well known. But a second way in which climate drives hunger is sometimes less visible because it does not always require big humanitarian operations. These are the more creeping variations and stresses, such as more irregular rainfall, changing onsets and offsets of the seasons, or rising salinity in soils and groundwater. When pests and disease patterns shift, when you have growing heat stress in livestock. These stresses, they do not create big humanitarian disasters, but they put households into a much more vulnerable place. So that when even a smaller shock happens, and that is no matter where it comes from, it can be from COVID, it can be an economic shock, it can be another smaller seasonal, maybe climate shock, that can already lead to a food crisis then. So to effectively help people manage the impacts of climate change on hunger, we need to manage both aspects. So the extreme events and also the stresses and the creeping problems that chip away at people's livelihoods.
This first part of our conversation, Laura, is really about some of the problems that we're seeing with climate change and the link with hunger. You are country officer for the World Food Programme in Guatemala. What are your biggest challenges right now?
Well, so much of what you've been talking about, the other two panelists, Hindou and Gernot, are so familiar to what we face in Guatemala, even though it's such a different context in terms of geography, in terms of history. But again, it's a country that it's extremely vulnerable. It's one of the most vulnerable around the world in terms of shocks, in terms of natural shocks. It's a country, Guatemala, that it's vulnerable to earthquakes, volcanoes, droughts, floods, and now, of course, the pandemic, which has really seriously affected in many different ways and has compounded many of the issues we're already facing. But what we saw is that throughout years, because so many farmers really depend on agriculture, subsistence agriculture for their survival, to feed themselves, to feed their families, and really to earn a living. Because of climatic shocks, recurrent droughts, or as Gernot was talking about, sometimes is a lot more subtle. It's just the weather patterns that change slightly. So, for example, in Guatemala, it's very typical that there is a period of the year that it's called canicula, has an interesting name, but it's normally about 2 weeks into the growing season where there is no rain. And it's fine if there is 2 weeks, but sometimes these 2 weeks turn into 4 weeks. And that is enough to destroy the whole harvest, and therefore people have nothing to eat. And so this just leads so many of them to desperate measures, including migration, a topic that we're talking about a lot. But when people have nothing to eat, when they have no harvest, they can't sell, they can't trade, what are the alternatives? The alternatives are to go elsewhere, to look for a way, for an alternative. So, for example, what it's normally traditionally known as the dry corridor of Guatemala, which is a specific area that in fact goes through Honduras and El Salvador. It's also it's a Central America area. In fact, nowadays, when we look at the impact of climate and where food insecurity is present as a result of these climatic shocks, it's well beyond what we call the traditional dry corridor. The whole country is turning into some sort of a dry corridor, and that's extremely concerning.
I love that I have the three of you here. We have this wonderful trifecta. So we have a country director in Guatemala where migration is being connected to the climate crisis. We have Hindou in the Chad region who knows intimately about how the climate has changed. And then we have Gernot, who is really tackling this on a global perspective for the World Food Programme. Gernot, what would you like to ask Hindou about her work? How will that information help your work?
It's a good question. I mean, one story that I remember from Kenya is that we were talking with highland farmers about indigenous adaptation solutions. So basically, what can also scientists learn from existing know-how on how people in vulnerable conditions have managed climate pressures? And people in Kenya, basically, they said, whenever we talk about climate change, we don't even mention the term global warming. I mean, we have problems with the weather, and our problem is that the traditional knowledge that we got from our fathers and they got from theirs, right now, this traditional knowledge that is not sufficient in order to manage these big variations we see. We might have learned from our father to plant the first seed of maize when we feel the first drop of rain within the first 2 weeks of the onset of the rains. But now we plant, we have maybe 2 days of rain, and then we have 6 to 8 weeks of a dry spell, and the whole harvest goes. Or we plant, and then all the rainfall that is normally supposed to fall over 4 or 5 weeks comes down in one afternoon and washes everything away. So I would wanna maybe know from Hindou how she experiences this in Chad, and whether she believes that the traditional strategies, the traditional knowledge that farmers there have to deal with climate impacts, because climate shocks are nothing new in the Sahel, right? There's a long track record of those, so there are existing strategies. But in how far does she see the current situation differently, in the sense that these variations are becoming stronger, more extreme, and put also traditional knowledge into a certain, it restrains options for people. That's a question I would like to ask her.
Thank you. This is a very good question. So yeah, it's really a very good questions. Of course, in my communities, we do have also the traditional knowledge. So what's happening, I can tell you firstly, in my peoples, there is no TV, there is no electricity, so there is no weather forecast or whatever. So we are all relying in the nature and in what nature can give us as information in order to survive, in order to have our food. And nature is our supermarket. That's what I used to say. And nature is our pharmacy. And it is also our fridge, because we can dry up the food and conserve it for the next coming season. But how we know all this? In my community, while we are pastoralists and nomadic, we do not have like houses where we can sit on it when it's raining or not. So we move always and build a smaller house and just to move the next day. So it is so important for us to learn from nature. This is how we get connected so deeply with our environment. Even there is climate change, even there is extreme weather events, but we are resilient and we adapt our knowledge to what is changed. Otherwise, we cannot survive. So how we adapt our knowledge? We observe a different species in the nature. For example, when it's going to be a rain season that's coming, in the normal or Western calendars, they know, they just count, okay, in the 8th of April is going to be this season entering. 9th of March, that season is going out. But no, we cannot count on exact day. So we observe firstly the astrological knowledge. The moon, the sun, the star positions. So when we observe all this, so it's help us to come down from the astrology to the ecological knowledge. So we observe the wind, we observe the trees, flowers, trees, fruits. We observe then the astrological, meteorological knowledge, the wind directions. If the wind is coming from south or north, if the wind is heavy, or if the wind is drought. And then we go again observe the animals. So our own cattle, when the rain season is coming, in addition to all what I tell you, so we observe our cattle. They just lie down, they get them head facing the south. They will never put them head down to the ground. The head is up. You can beat them, you can do everything. They will never turn them head to the north, or they will never lie down. So then they are sniffing through the air that coming from the south, so that there is no cautions. You can see no cloud, you can see nothing. It is the rain season coming. We have to get out from Lake Chad area, because otherwise it's going to be flooding and we will not get the pastures. So in order to observe all these different knowledge system, it's help us to be resilient and adapt even the climate is changing. And then we know how we can get the pastures, how we can put our food security. So that's why it is so important to understand the way of living of indigenous peoples in connection with the nature.
Hindou, I love what you just said, because I used to be a weather forecaster. And what you are telling me is how to be a weather forecaster Chad style, which is phenomenal. That all of our clues about what is happening with our climate and our weather and the seasons is right under our noses if we choose to look at it. Thank you so much. I need to talk to you a little bit later. We'll have a conversation offline, because I want to learn some very traditional methods of how to tell the weather. Thank you so much. Let me bring in some of the conversation from our audience. Thank you, audience, for taking part in that conversation. I'm going to put this one to you, Laura. This one is from Diego. Diego says it's vital to talk about how climate change drives hunger, which in turn increases conflict, which can destabilize entire regions and have a multiplier effect. I'm very grateful for the stories being shared here about that connection. Laura, you know about that impact. You alluded to it as you were talking about how are you seeing the climate crisis playing out in Guatemala, but also in the surrounding area. People sometimes think, climate crisis and conflict and hunger, but that is possible, right, Laura?
Well, I mean, WFP, as you know, has won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm saying this not to show off as such, but on how the issues that we handle have a direct link with peace and stability. And that's precisely because of this connection. Because when you have people being hungry, when there isn't enough to eat, as any of us would do, we would be ready to take desperate measures to feed our children. I mean, if any of us, we see that we don't have enough to feed our small child, we'll do anything to find an alternative, right? And that's exactly what we see here in this region. We see people, if there is a recurrent drought like we had over the past 5 years, for example, with Gernot, we were talking a lot about how can we find alternatives to bring resilience to these communities, because year after year after year, they have droughts, they have floods, they have droughts. So therefore, they don't have enough to eat. They lose their livelihoods. And also, for example, many of these families, they rely either on what they grow or casual work, for example, in agriculture, in coffee production, in cocoa production. But those two are affected by climate change. Those two mean that people lose their jobs. For example, with ETA and IOTA, a lot of I visited personally a community where many people worked on banana plantations, and they had their own banana plantations that they would contribute to the global kind of community farming, but also their own food production. Everything vanished. everything. So there was this man telling me, look, this banana production has been very good for me. I built a house, I built this. Now I have nothing. So if people are ready to take desperate measures, they're ready to migrate under extremely dangerous circumstances, as we see every day, where people cross the border illegally from Honduras to Guatemala to Mexico to reach the United States, for example. Or as you know, this part of the world, there is also a huge issue with drug trafficking, with criminal groups that are, if you have nothing to eat, and one of these criminal groups offers you an opportunity to earn a living or to earn some money, of course, people are very tempted. So this is where this series of factors really compound and come together, really increasing a very delicate formula, a very delicate combination of rather explosive factors potentially in terms of peace, security, climate, and food.
You've done a really good job of setting up what is the challenge, what are our problems right now with the climate crisis impacting people and hunger and food security. We have a lot of questions from our audience about what do we do? Resilience. What ideas do you have? That is going to be our next section. But first, I want to really look at the cost, the human cost of the climate crisis and the financial cost of the climate crisis. I'm going to take you to Honduras to meet Marlene and her family.
Hacer lo que puedo para luchar, seguir luchando por mis hijos. Que uno de padre prefiere que los hijos coman que uno no. Gracias a Dios, el día que ustedes nos trajeron la ración, yo me sentí feliz porque es como que me haya caído del cielo. No tenía nada para ellos.
According to our surveys, now 15% of the people are seeking to migrate. If we compare that figures with 2018, in 2018 we're just 8%. And if we compare just one country like Honduras, in Honduras 17% of the people are thinking now in migrate because of this crisis. So WSP is ready to continue helping governments. We are planning to reach 2.6 million in 2021, and we need $46 million to cover that gap.
The human cost and the financial cost of the climate crisis when it impacts people and their access to food. We are going to be looking in this section of our conversation at building resilience, looking for solutions. Our panelists have them and our audience want to know what they are. Let me just go. I'm going to give this one to you, Gernot. This one is a really good question. It comes from Stephen. How are local governments reacting to the effects of climate-driven hunger? How is the World Food Programme working with these governments? Gernot?
Yeah. Climate disasters, very often we talk about natural disasters, but there's really nothing natural about disasters. Disasters always happen when hazards, climatic hazards in our case, meet up with conditions of vulnerability. And these conditions of vulnerability, they drive really the root causes of hunger. So usually, like in the case of the dry corridor in Central America, you have a climate extreme or more recently a barrage of climate extremes, which can come in any combination, storm, eta, iota, followed by drought, hit the population that is already on the brink. People have no food stocks to fall back on, no money left for medicines. Most trees have already been cut down for firewood. Children have been taken out of school. So any approach that governments or also humanitarian agencies employ in such conditions is a combination of things rather than one single technology or approach alone. So very often when we talk about solutions and resilience building, we focus on three elements. The first one has already, I think, been set up by Hindou very nicely. We work with nature. We help people restore degraded landscapes and turn these landscapes into natural buffers against climate shocks. The second one is we help them anticipate climate problems, basically forecast what is on the cards in the next season, in the next year. And the third one is we try to build social and financial safety nets for the most vulnerable. So restoring, anticipating, and protecting. And the restoring part, I think, is really important because it is not very well known. When people think about WFP, they usually think about logistics, they think about airdrops, they think about big humanitarian operations. But we also work with food insecure communities to rehabilitate these natural buffers against climate shocks. So people establish hedgerows and terraces to counter erosion, ponds and reservoirs to counter dry spells and drought, green belts and gabion walls to protect against floods. And these nature-based solutions, which sometimes in the context of these international climate negotiations are also referred to as ecosystem-based adaptation, these work at scale. In the past 5 years, these programs have rehabilitated, reforested over 1.5 million hectares of land, which is roughly the size of Connecticut. So they have also established 53,000 ponds, wells, reservoirs, planted over 6 billion trees. So this is a story about the World Food Program that not everybody knows. We work with vulnerable people to restore degraded landscapes at scale. And the second critical element that I mentioned is anticipation. So we help governments and communities establish climate information and early warning systems. And we make sure that and these systems are connected with financing and action plans, which then kick into gear before people get hit by disasters. If river levels in Bangladesh rise by 1 meter within 24 hours, we then release warning information and cash support before communities get hit. And this allows people then to evacuate, to prepare, brace for impact. This is not only faster than traditional humanitarian aid, it is also more cost effective, and it cuts our response costs by at least half. And the last point I want to mention here, I mentioned restoring, anticipating. The last point is protecting. So the most vulnerable people require safety nets. If there is no safety net that enables you to get back on your feet after you have been hit by a climate disaster, you really have no other choice than to migrate and to look for opportunities in a different livelihood strategy, in a different region. So we try to make climate insurance solutions work for food insecure people. And WFP is the leading UN agency making this happen. Last year, which was a really difficult year because of COVID, we have helped to protect 2.2 million people in 13 countries with climate risk insurance solutions. And those are folks that normally would not be on the map of many insurance companies because they're poor, they cannot afford premiums. But WFP found solutions to make this happen. And that is a really important safety net, especially when governments are already grappling with COVID impacts and economic impacts. And I see Laura already raising her hand because she is in a country that is thinking strong.
Yeah. Go ahead, Laura.
Well, indeed, it really resonates to us what Gernot has just said, and the issue of insurance for us is really something we are really interested in. We are pushing through to develop kind of a new kind of insurance, what we call a micro insurance, and this is a really complicated legal process that goes with it, that involves logarithms and calculations, etc. And we are so pleased that we're going to start piloting that for smallholder farmers here in Guatemala as a way to protect them from every single shock. But what's even more interesting is that one of the first groups with whom we're going to pilot this micro insurance is a group of women, and I want to drive this back to the women as being a particular group of interest, women and women of Indigenous, of Mayan origin here in Guatemala, which we've just visited now when our executive director was in Guatemala. This is a group of women with whom we've been working for the past 5 years almost. And we were working with them, on one hand, to give them some seed capital and some seed investment for them to diversify their livelihoods, for them to also learn new techniques and develop little businesses, as it were. And at the same time, we were also working with them to give them financial training, to establish a investment and savings, a credit and savings organization. And this is precisely in one of these areas of Guatemala where there's recurrent floods, droughts, droughts. And now came COVID. And the most fascinating story about that is that they were telling our executive director, David Beasley, look, when COVID came, many of our husbands lost their jobs because they were casual labor and so there was no more work for them. And the fact that we had this organization and we had our savings basically enabled us to stay afloat during this really difficult period. So this is what made the difference for them to starve or actually being able to cope with a shock, with a disaster. And these are the kind of things that we need to invest in. These are the kind of training and accompanying this, and women are extremely important because so often they really are the glue to the family unit and the community, and they need to be empowered to really manage their economy for the benefit of their communities and their families. So these kind of examples is what I really think we want to reinforce and invest and think about creative financial tools as well, so that we really protect people and don't make them always dependent on food aid and humanitarian assistance that we see around the world continuously.
Mm-hmm. All right. Sharon Hockenbury is watching us panel right now. Sharon says, I love this discussion, especially Hindou's description of the cattle weather forecasters. I love this. Another comment from Shushil Raj. Hi, Shushil. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Hindou, for explaining the importance and complexity of traditional knowledge systems and how they help. Indigenous communities have the solutions as natural stewards of the environment. Hindou, that brings to me to the reason why we're talking to you and Gernot and also Laura is because we really wanted to not just talk about the problems of the climate crisis and hunger, but also address resilience and solutions. And you have come with concrete solutions. Share one of them with us.
Sure. So before I share them, I really wanted to jump to the previous discussions. I wanted to say what both of you said is resonating with you. But I do not see this color in my region. I'm so surprised. Let me make really this discussion like it is not what's happening in the ground. If that's happening in the Sahel regions, we cannot have the food insecurity increase. I'm really telling you from the ground, from what we are seeing. We do not see those solutions. What we see from the World Food Program, it's when there is hunger, when there is warmth, when there is maybe food insecurity, they come with the maize, with the sugar, giving to the peoples for the just short responses. We do not see these long-term responses. So maybe it is a pilot project, but I don't want the world to work with the pilot project every time. I wanted my peoples to go out of this hunger. Even the climate change is there. Why not? You cannot multiply those kind of the project in the Sahel regions also, and peoples can restore the ecosystem, and then they can do the loss and damage response around all this insurance system, and then peoples can build them on resilience. I think those global responses can apply to also African countries where the hunger is always like our daily reality. We don't want to have this first. We wanted to change the narrative. Coming back to your questions, of course, we are building our own resilience. through our traditional knowledge. And I'm going to share with you 2 examples of the work that I'm doing. Of course, to Laura's point on the women's. So we are helping the women to build their own resilience, and we call it, this project is adaptation to the climate change impact. So how they can adapt when the climate change came. Man leave the communities during the dry season to go find the job in the big cities, or they will never come back. So those women who stay back home, so they become more innovators. And what we do, we just like support them a little bit. So I'm doing now a project on agroecology. So firstly, working on the land tenure for women, because women do not own the land. And if they do not own the land, they cannot develop a resilience or adaptation project, and they cannot produce for them food. So we work around the land tenure with the local government and also communities leaders. And when the women got this land, and then they commit to do an agroecology. In each place, they plant a trees and they do a veggie during the dry season, and they do the normal agriculture during the rain season. So that helped them to use the traditional knowledge, but also feed them families and have the income revenue in order to send them children to the schools. So this project is so responsive to the climate change into the food security. And it's just done at the community level. When the Western countries are calling to the organic food, so we already like doing the organic food in a natural way and responding to the climate change. And another project that how we can scale it up from the local level to the international level, and how we can put the traditional knowledge and the science knowledge together. While the community do not want to school, they cannot read and write, so the scientists cannot work with them. So we create a model to make them work together. So this is the 3D participatory mapping. So the mapping is using the science knowledge and traditional knowledge, putting the community together to build a map with the geographical information and put all the knowledge. It can help to better manage the shrinking resources and help to empower the community to build their own resilience. So those knowledge are so important. So the World Food Program must work with us on the ground in order to scale up those projects and help the communities to move from just to having the food response for the short term, but building the resilience and climate adaptation for the long term.
Message received, Hindou. Thank you. I want to bring in you, Laura, because I've got a really interesting question from Lubna. Lubna says, thank you for the information that has been shared so far, especially as it affects the livelihood of farmers in Guatemala. Is there any program that introduces new crop varieties that are tolerant to drought that could help in sustaining the livelihoods and incomes of local communities? Laura.
Yes, that's exactly part of the work that we do in terms of the resilience work. I think that when we're looking at resilience, we're looking at really how do we change the system whereby people are not just dependent on one or two crops that they grow in a very traditional way that are dependent on the rain that comes or does not come. So we look at really diversification of livelihoods. So how can we find different livelihoods, different systems that they can earn a living, not being only dependent on one particular crop. Secondly, how do we introduce agriculture techniques that are more sustainable? So, and that means soil recovery, for example, that Gernot was talking about earlier, use of crops that are more resistant to drought, and also irrigation techniques that are really sustainable and low water consuming. So a whole different kind of techniques. And as I was telling you, also the insurances and this kind of something that is extremely important, and I think is a little bit what Hindou was referring to, is how do you make, and since you are a weather forecast person, how can we make this information, weather information, relevant and understandable for smallholder farmers and people? Again, a lot of women. I know, and this is Absolutely. I mean,
it doesn't
it's
connect.
really so true.
Yes.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And even in countries like Guatemala, where there is, and other countries where I've worked before, there is a weather forecast service. They produce bulletins that are specifically for agriculture. And even if I read them, I'm still like, ooh, those maps, they look cool, but I'm not sure I understand them. So how do break down this information, particularly to women who, in the case of Guatemala, they don't even speak Spanish because they've never been to school. They are illiterate, and there is all this fragmentation of ethnic identities and languages that we need to reach each of these groups in their own language, in their own tradition, in their own culture. So how do we make that accessible? But not only the information, how do we then train them to use this information? So that maybe, as Indu was saying, this year the rain is coming not on the 8th of March, but we can see that the pattern is that it's going to arrive, or that it's... So what does that mean in terms of when I plant? What does that mean in terms of maybe the variety that we're going to use? So all this knowledge needs to be broken down and translated and introduced to the communities in a very user-friendly and culturally relevant way.
Accessible. There is a movement, Laura. I'm so glad you brought this up. And it's really part of the whole climate action movement, which is, if we are sharing meteorological information about your environment, the people receiving it are citizens. We need to understand it. So rather than talking about a cold front or high pressure, actually explain what that actually means. Now, what's going to be falling on your head, or maybe not going to be falling on your head. There is a movement. So push your local forecasters, your local weather organization to do that, because if they're talking, we don't understand, what is the point? Don't get me started, Laura. All right, so I want to show you an example of resilience in action. The Sahel region is a region that Hindou has been talking about. It is just south of the Sahara Desert. So that gives you a clue to really what the climate may well be like and what the farming conditions may well be like. What it is like to farm in that region for some farmers, with also the assistance and support of the World Food Programme. Let's take a look. When I first watched that video, it reminded me that the World Food Programme's work is not just about feeding people when they're in a disastrous situation. It's about preventative action so they don't get to that disastrous situation. That pretty much sums up what Hindou was saying earlier. Hindou, is that project, or projects like those, are they scaling up now? So you see more of preventative action rather than emergency urgent action?
I love that. I mean, that's what we need. We don't want to have just an emergency response and full stop the next of the day. We have to struggle again. We wanted to have the long term. When I'm seeing those men and women in the video, I'm feeling so proud and I'm feeling so good because they know how to manage the land. They are engineers of those fragile ecosystem. So if they just push them a little bit with the financial support, with the training, or with the materials, or with the weather forecast that can add to their own traditional knowledge, they can turn this land into a dreams for them children. They will turn it into a living place for the entire community. So those kind of response projects are so important for the man and women of the Sahel. And you know what? Sahel have more than 70% of the young peoples there. It is a big hope. So we need to build up all those projects in order to give this young generation to regreen the Sahel and to respond to the food insecurity. Because we know population are growing. That's what they are telling us. But no, even the population is growing. We have the method to feed them up. So let us do it together. I'm so happy to see this video.
Panel, I want us to focus the last few minutes of our discussion on what do we want our audience to do? What should we be doing? Because we promised a conversation connecting climate crisis with hunger and solutions, and now we're going to give them an assignment. What should that assignment be, Gernot?
Well, I would have, many ideas for assignments, but maybe let me start with one that is quite distinctly related to tomorrow. Tomorrow is Earth Day. So my assignment would be, please, let's not celebrate Earth Day only on the 22nd of April. Let's have Earth Day on every day we have a meal. I know that many people in the audience have, the Share the Meal app on their mobile phones, and that our programs rely also on the people and partners that are listening in today. So I hope that we will have a few follow-up conversations with some of them after this event. But there are additional ways to help too. We can, for example, become more aware about the environmental and carbon footprint of our food choices. We can avoid food waste. If food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter after China and the US. So if we eliminate food waste, if we push for more conversations about the important connections between food and climate, then I think we have already made big progress for more sustainable solutions. So that would be maybe one ask. Let's have Earth Day every day. We eat a meal.
I love that. Earth Day is every day. All right. So Laura, I am thinking that where you are in Guatemala, the climate crisis is a climate emergency. There is an urgency for climate action. What is your call to action for all of us?
I mean, I think I'd go for two things. One is to think this is not a problem for Guatemala or a problem for the Sahel. This is a problem for everybody. And we have to really make this very clear to all of us. This is not just affecting us, it's affecting everybody. So we need to be very aware of that. And secondly, of course, I'd like to have the resources and those who can really invest and help us invest on finding and addressing the root causes of this problem, to help us doing that, to help us work with the women, help us establish this microinsurance, help us in funding some of the projects that can really change the story of so many lives, so many children in Guatemala who can move from being chronically malnourished to really having a hope and being able to fulfill their dreams in their communities, in their homes, without having to go and start thinking about how they're going to migrate, as we saw in this woman in the video from this family in Honduras. So help us work with the local communities. That would be my other call. Help us invest here. And this is an investment in all of us, not just in Guatemala.
Hindou, I was just thinking about how you started out as an activist and environmentalist, and you were very young. You were just a teen. Sometimes it feels like there's a lot to do when we're trying to take care of our environment, but you did it when you were young. What got you started? What inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you're born an indigenous person, you're already born an activist because you already struggle for your peoples to access to the land, to access to the territories, to get respect, to access to the clean water. You know, until now, my people do not have like clean water to drink. While we are facing COVID, that people's asking to washing hand even at least 5 times a day. So you already born an activist because you wanted your community to get access to this one. So what get me in, because I got a strong mom who understand the challenge of the world that we are going to face, and who put me to school, me and my sister. And while I went to school, I understood how my people are so marginalized, are so rejected by the others without knowing us, just so they rejected us because we are coming from a rural area. So then I stand up to fight at that time to the right of the girls who have my age. And I understood directly that I can't fight for the human rights without fighting to the environment rights. And that both objective come together. So that's why, like, my call also will be to all the young peoples there. You know, you can do it. Just to fix your objective. And you can do it. You can be an activist for every rights that you wanted to have, because I did it while being in indigenous communities. You can also do it. And my other call is we have to know how to live in harmony with nature. If you do not respect nature, you are harming yourself. Protect nature, respect nature, and nature will respect you back. We cannot talk about human rights without talking about environment rights, because those both going together. Right to food, it is right to access to land. Right to food, it is right to development. Right to food, it is right also to live in a decent place. If you have empty stomach, you cannot think to going to school or healing yourself. You're just thinking about food. So we need all to get the right to the food and right to the right food, not just like food to make people's obesity, but equitable food who can give us dignity as human beings. So I started like that, and I know that many people can do it. We can be an example as indigenous communities for all of you.
Thank you, Hindou. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Gernot. Thank you, fabulous discussion audience. I see you on social media. We were watching you and bringing in some of your comments and questions. Really appreciate you doing that. So if you signed up, if you registered for this event, you will be receiving an email quite soon. We would love your feedback. Just take a moment, have a look, put your feedback in it. Are you able to make Earth Day every day? Are you inspired by the cattle weather forecasters of Chad? Did what Laura say to you resonate about migration and climate crisis and why people are having to leave their own homes and travel because they're hungry and they have nothing to eat? Did that resonate? We want your feedback. We would love your feedback. So look out for that email. So the Us Against Hunger discussion series continues. The next one, are you ready for this? Save the date. October the 14th. The time is noon Eastern time, and we will be talking about food systems. Thank you for joining us today. Take care, everybody.